The social media ban in Florida, will it save lives?
The American Association of Pediatrics has come out and said the danger window on social media is between the ages of 10 and 13, maybe 14, when kids enter into puberty. That's because their brains literally begin to change to give them more social rewards. This is about kids beginning to disconnect from their parents and connect onto their peers as part of growing up. Having kids wait until they're 14 is important because it lets kids go through that important but vulnerable window without having to constantly make a personal brand. We take for granted as adults what it's like to be a 12-year-old girl. The American Academy of Pediatrics has said that the danger window for social media is between the ages of 10 and 14, when kids' brains literally begin to change as they detach from their families and begin to attach onto their peers, because they feel social rewards much more intensely. They have more oxytocin and dopamine receptors in their brains. That means a compliment feels so much more satisfying, but a criticism hurts all the more. You and I will never get another compliment that feels as good as a compliment a teenage girl gets, but we'll also never feel the pain that criticism can, which is probably good. When kids are on social media, they end up in a situation where there's a flood of social interactions that are permanent. It used to be if someone criticized your jeans as you walked down the hallway in your middle school, that criticism evaporated. You could go home. It was harder to ruminate on it. Now when kids get bullied, all of those interactions, they can sit and review them late at night when they're feeling stressed. Or even worse, kids can continue to bully them all the way up until bedtime.
For better or for worse, social media is ingrained in society though, so what is the point of delaying the inevitable?
So it's this question of there's lots of substances that we intentionally say, you can totally, as an adult, consume this, and it's reasonably safe. These are things like we set ages on when kids start drinking or when they have access to cigarettes. And that's because when kids are more mature, they have a better ability to self-regulate. Having kids wait until 14 or maybe even 16, if you'll notice, the way the Florida bill was written, it still requires parental approval for the ages of 15 and 16. That gives a chance for kids to catch up. These products weren't designed for kids under the age of 13. They definitely, I would say, weren't really designed for kids under the age of 16. This gives kids a chance to be at least a little bit on a fairer footing as they go into these environments.
Officially, you have to be 13 to partake in social media already. So what is the difference with this ban?
One of the things that we've seen so far is that the rules on being under 13 are not strongly enforced. So one of the things that the Florida ban introduced is that if a child is on social media, for example, let's say their parent said, please take my child's account down, and the platform didn't comply, there's a $10,000 liability that would be paid out to that child as harm. One of the things that came out of the 44-state class action lawsuit against Meta was that at various points over the last few years, Meta had between 2.5 million and 3.5 million accounts where someone had said, this is a child's account, please take it down. And those accounts, instead of being taken down, sat in a queue waiting for someone to review them. Sometimes to the point where parents would call in or write in multiple times saying, please take my child's account down, and it still wouldn't come down. This law hopefully will make consequences such that the platforms will actually comply.
It's hard to understand how it could be policed. So is that going to require, like you say, people to actually spot child's accounts and then effectively dob them in?
One of the things that's interesting about how the conversation has flowed around what does it mean to keep kids off of these platforms is usually they decay into, should we check IDs? The reality is we have lots of different tools for spotting underage users. If you go on Instagram today, you can find kids' bios that say, I'm a 4th grader at Jones Elementary. Kids report each other to punish each other because if they're mean. So for example, you're mean to me at recess, you're going to lose your Instagram account. When we look at how AI works, if you can find even 10,000 children's accounts, you can use all the other signals that are on these platforms, the content that kids engage with, who their friends are, the fact that kids can't type very quickly or spell very effectively. You can find the underage users. You don't have to say, like, show me an ID in order to be able to use these platforms.
Kids do know their way around false IDs. I mean, what's stopping them just using that to access these platforms?
Well, the question is, are they going to stop engaging with material that their peers engage with? Are they going to stop having friends that are also younger? Like, the nature of how these detection systems work is, unless a kid is going to stop showing up at a primary school every day, they're going to stop having other children for friends, they're going to somehow learn to spell at the level that adults do. When you stack all these signals together, each individual one might be only 90% effective. But when you start having what's known as defense in depth, you can find all the kids, and they're not going to be able to wiggle around it.
Surely it comes down to parents just doing right by their children and helping them through the scourge that can be of social media. But why the need for the ban? Why does it need to be put in law?
When you talk to parents, so particularly parents of kids that are in these danger zones, say 10 to 14, if you make this an issue of just, are you a good parent, it becomes a fight between a parent and a child. In the United States, there's a large movement called Wait for 8, which is wait for 8th grade, or about 14, where it says, this is not a problem that is solved at the level of a single child and a single parent, because then it becomes a fight every single day of, like, I'm the last one who doesn't have a phone. Instead, it becomes a question of saying, so in the case of Wait for 8, whole schools will say, our children exist in community, right? This community is choosing to wait until kids are a little bit more ready. And I think the biggest reason of saying, like, are younger children ready for social media? Even if you talk to 16-year-olds, you talk to 18-year-olds, it's already hard for them to rate limit how much they use it. Things like sleep deprivation are incredibly vital while kids' brains are growing. These apps are designed to be addictive, to keep you just like glued to them. And the question is, do we want to ask children to basically be the last line of defense against hundreds of engineers, hundreds of product designers whose full-time job is figuring out how to keep them on these platforms as much as possible? Or is the solution to come in and say, at least give them a chance. Let them catch up to the point where they're not quite as seductive. They're not quite as impactful. Sometimes people reduce down the conversation around social media to, why can't parents just be good parents? Why can't they, for example, like you said, hold their hands through these things? When we look at social media as a thing that must be resolved between just a child and a parent, it ignores what the actual significance is of that conflict. If you talk to parents of kids who are in this age window, it becomes a constant nagging fight of, I'm the last one who doesn't have a phone. In the United States, many school communities have acknowledged how grating, how divisive this is within families, and said, this is not a problem that is solved at the level of a single kid and a single family. Children exist in community. We're going to do things like sign pledges as a community when kids are, 7, 8 years old, saying, we're going to wait for 8th. We're going to wait for 8th grade when kids are about 14. Because that way, when that conversation happens, they can say, oh, no, as a community, we've decided to wait. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is that these apps are designed not by a few people. They're designed by teams of hundreds of sophisticated engineers, product designers, to be as sticky as possible. I'm almost 40, and I have trouble going to sleep because YouTube is so sticky. How is a 12-year-old whose brain needs to get high quality sleep every night, if they're going to get to grow up to their full potential, how is a 12-year-old supposed to resist those hundreds, if not thousands, of product designers who are out there trying to make apps that are as compulsive as possible?
You've worked for Facebook, of course. Are social media companies targeting children that age?
One of the things I'm kind of shocked by is how little press the multi-state class action lawsuit in the United States against Meta has gotten, even in the United States. So think about how rarely 44 states in the US ever agree to something. 44 states have brought a lawsuit saying that Facebook intentionally lied about targeting kids and intentionally lied about the impacts of their products. One of the things that's shocking as you read through these court filings is they have page after page after page of internal discussions, emails, documents, where people talk about how do you get kids online, even kids under the age of 13. That even though they said publicly, we don't have kids under the age of 13, they tracked metrics around that internally. The reason why they want to get kids so young is they know if they get kids young, and like one of the kind of more, shows you how they think about this, quotes from the docs was, the young ones are the good ones, is that you get someone young and that becomes their social network for life. Each individual platform is scared that if they don't get, the next set of 10-year-olds, the next set of 12-year-olds, the next set of 14-year-olds, that someone else will get them. If it's not Instagram, it'll be TikTok. If it's not TikTok, it'll be Discord. And that when we look forward in 10 years, that community will age as that is their social platform. Think about millennials. Like they make fun of millennials of, they're on Facebook, right? It's because that's what they aged up with. And that's why companies go after these younger users.
So behind the scenes, they're actively forming strategies to attract people, as you say, as young as 10.
I would go and I can send you all the filings. Like what's part of why they didn't get covered well is Facebook's lawyers got to choose what to redact when they were initially released. And only later did they release all those shocking documents. Like the courts basically came in and said, no, the public has a right to know. And when you read through the documents, you'll get great pull quotes you can put in your documentary if you want to, because it's very clear that they intentionally were doing this.
How do they intentionally target children as young as 10?
Well, it's things like when you have a queue that has 3.5 million accounts that are under 13, that someone has already told you are under 13, and you choose not to review them, that's a great example of saying we're gonna keep these kids on there as long as possible. You give them a chance to age out into actually being okay users. It's things like one of the things the documents discuss is Facebook had conversations around should we turn off notifications during the school day, because kids reported it makes them anxious, it distracts them from school, makes them less productive. One of the reasons they chose not to was they said penetration in schools, like the more kids we can get in a single school community, the more usage we get. Like it's a network effect. They intentionally don't want to avoid these places because if the more kids they can get in any individual school community, the more usage and stickiness they'll get over time.
Since you testified and revealed this, have you seen safety measures being put in place?
It's interesting. They've had different moments over time where they get more attention and then they release more features. So for example, one of the things called out in the lawsuit was one of the big things they announced right after I came forward was they said, we're going to have reminders where kids can say, if I use this for more than 10 minutes, just give me a little nudge, like remind me, like, do I want to still be doing this? And when they initially rolled that out, so this is when all the media attention is focused on them, a month, 6 weeks after I came forward, the shortest duration of time they had was 10 minutes. A few months later, when the media attention faded away, they changed that minimum reminder time to 30 minutes. This winter, in January, they had a large Senate hearing around child exploitative material, child sexual abuse material in the U.S. Senate. In the couple of weeks before that hearing, they pushed out a bunch of new features. But a lot of them were things where you go, you weren't doing that already? So like one of the things they announced was they would no longer share eating disorder content, even if you were following someone. So like if you're a child under the age of 16, even if your friend posts something about an eating disorder, they won't deliver that to you. And you're like, oh, okay, so you're kind of now having a reasonable bar of safety on a few issues. But they don't give us any performance data. So they can announce these features, but if they don't announce this is how we tested to see that it actually had an impact, we should treat these features as marketing features, or marketing material, not necessarily as actual things that make our kids safer.
At the time, you said they should declare moral bankruptcy. Is that still the case?
I think it is. One of the things that really broke my heart personally when I was reading through the court filings was, I didn't think, like, I never worked on kids issues at Facebook, right? Like, I worked on issues around misinformation and ethnic violence, or issues around foreign interference and democracy. I didn't work on issues directly around kids. And reading through the filings, it became really apparent that they don't treat children as if they are our most vulnerable community members, right? The idea that children deserve extra protection or extra consideration. And that there were moments like, for example, when they ran the experiments to turn off notifications during the school day. Kids said, like, they went and they ran the research experiments. Kids said, I'm less stressed. I'm more productive in school. They stopped doing notifications late at night. Kids said I could sleep better. And they chose not to launch that feature, which should be kind of, common sense, because it decreased usage by 1%. When you trade off the well-being of children for 1% of growth, I think you have to declare bankruptcy. You have to say, we have to start over. We have to come clean if we're going to be able to move forward in an authentic way.
Well, you were there. Surely there are several people in those companies protesting such behaviour, or do most people just drink the Kool-Aid?
One of the challenges with Facebook is, and this is not obvious to everyone sitting on the outside, Mark Zuckerberg holds always north of 55% of all the voting shares inside of Facebook. So what that means is, in a normal corporation, there's different investors, different stakeholders who have the ability to say, we need to do a course correction. Inside of Facebook, there's only one opinion that matters, which is Mark Zuckerberg's. And what's very apparent from getting to read the corporate emails that the attorneys general were able to get out of the company is that there are good people inside the company trying to bring information to him, saying, like, we need to do better. And because Mark, I guess, can't fathom that the thing that he has spent his life building might be hurting people, or that he maybe has an obligation to do better, it doesn't matter that those concerns are happening, because his vote is the only vote that matters.
So to bring it back to the ban in Florida, what's stopping companies like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok just finding a loophole?
It's interesting. I read through the bill before I came on today, and I am mildly concerned that the law could be relatively easily stepped around. Because one of the things that's a little bit different about this law compared to, say, the Arkansas ban, or how certain things about how Utah wrote their law, is this law defines a social media company based on having a certain set of features. And among those features are things like autoplay videos. If you don't have autoplay videos, you're not a social network. Or if you don't have, what's the other one? There was another one that I was like, live streaming. You don't have live streaming, you're not a social media platform. I could imagine if, and the reason why they wrote this bill this way is they knew that the bill was susceptible to First Amendment objections. That the courts could come in and say, you can't restrict access to social media platforms because it's a First Amendment issue. They wrote this bill based on features because they wanted to say, no, this is a product safety bill. But when you have a list like that where you could just turn off your autoplay videos and now you don't count as a social network, if they lose on appeal and it goes into effect, I could totally imagine them just turning off the autoplay on videos and saying, okay, we take that loss. We don't have to enforce the bill now.
So that could happen. Could this ban just be all bark and no bite?
Well, I would assume the legislature would come in and then tweak the law. But I think it's symbolic of the fact that individual states are no longer waiting to protect children. We've had a bill in Congress for a couple years now that is trying to raise the safety bar called the Kids Online Safety Act. Individual states are now putting their feet down and saying, we can't wait any longer. You've told us every year this is the year. We're going to act if you're not going to act. And so I would assume that even if they find a loophole, states like Florida will amend their bills to go around those loopholes.
Does the ban go far enough?
I personally would demand much more transparency in any bill, like platform transparency, in any bill that wanted to be effective. Remember, we actually don't know that much as the public about how these platforms operate. That might sound surprising to a listener. You can say, Francis, you've been talking about these things for years. Like, you worked on systems like this for 10, 15 years. The reality is, for any similarly powerful organization system in our society, we don't have a few experts. We have hundreds or thousands of experts who understand how these systems work. And so modern standards, things like the Digital Services Act in the EU, give access to researchers and mandated public transparency on how these platforms work, because that way we can build up that expert core to actually have democratic participation. The bill doesn't have anything along those lines, and that's one of the things that we need to push and demand more for.
You touched on it, but can you explain how this will be policed in Florida?
In the United States, there are a number of highly controversial social issues where instead of having the main mechanism of enforcement be, say, a regulator stepping in, they introduce something known as a private right of action. So, for example, Texas introduced an abortion ban where instead of having the state of Texas punishing abortion providers, it allowed anyone in the state to sue someone who facilitated an abortion. In this case, it's similar. If you report your child's account and they don't take it down, you can fine them. You can be awarded a $10,000 reward. They'll fine the platform for that violation. In a world where there are millions of young people on Meta's products across the United States, that's a huge potential liability for the company, and you would expect the company to act to avoid such a risk.
You do expect, though, right, that kids under 14 will find their way around this ban?
So I think it's really important to understand we bleed so much data off of ourselves on these platforms. Like when privacy advocates say, if you care about your privacy, you can't use social media. What they mean is everything from how you type to the words you use to communicate, to the time of day you log in, to how often you log in. All of these things bleed information about you. It is trivial to find underage users of these platforms. Like if you want to find someone who's underage, you can find them. The reason why kids under the age of 14, under the age of 13 are on these platforms today is because the platforms choose to let them be on there. And so a kid can try to sign up, but if you look at there are other platforms out there that are better at detecting underage users and bringing them down. It's all a question of, are the incentives in place that encourage platforms to act responsibly?
So excuse the ignorance, but will it be as simple as a child having to provide ID as part of an authentication system, or is it a bit more high-tech than that?
I think it's a question of, I would assume, so IDs only need to be involved for something called an appeal. So let's say you join, you are 12 years old. The reality is 12-year-olds engage with different media than adults do, right? They have different conversation topics. They sign on at different times of day. They friend different people. They type in different ways. You could imagine there will be exceptions. There will be people who have, say, a developmental delay, and they engage with these platforms like a 12-year-old would. That person might come in and say, I got labeled as a 12-year-old. I'm appealing it. Like, I will show you my driver's license. But you don't need to make IDs the first line of defense when you have all these other tools for identifying who a child is.
So you're still relying on the social media company to police themselves?
So one of the things, an example of data that can be effective for monitoring the quality of these systems is you can ask things like, what fraction of people who appeal actually are successfully appeal, right? How many accounts do you take down on any given day? Like how often do you detect someone trying to sign on? How old was that account before you brought that account down? Or things like analyses that Facebook themselves have run before. So for context, even if you lied about how old you were when you joined, and let's be honest, lots of adults lie about their ages when they sign up for services. You don't want to give them your real birthday. Any advertising fueled site has an estimated age for you. And that's because they want to be able to target you with that 40th birthday getaway vacation. You can do things like say, tell me the kids you think are 16 years old. What fraction of them were on your platform 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago? Facebook has run analyses like this before where they look at 14-year-olds and they say, what fraction of our 14-year-olds were on the platform 4 or 5 years ago? And what they find is, so the paper that I brought out in the Facebook files did this analysis on Facebook.com. And remember, Facebook.com by the late teens was not very popular with children. And yet there were periods of time there where 10% of 10-year-olds still had Facebook accounts. So we can ask them for data that lets us assess how effectively they're doing this. We need to hold them to a higher standard and make sure that kids are not on these platforms during their periods of developmental vulnerability.
Again, though, just to be clear, so it would require a parent to complain that they haven't taken their kid's account down for them to be fined, or will this be policed in another manner?
So I have not read it in great depth. I read the qualification sections and some of the penalties. I don't know exactly the intentions of Florida for auditing these systems. But we know today that there are parents that most parents are attentive, and they notice when their kids do things like have social media accounts. And so in a world where, remember, in the United States, a shockingly high fraction of households don't have even $400 available for use in an emergency. In a world where you could file a complaint with Facebook and get $10,000 because they didn't take your child's account down, there's going to be a lot of parents that are going to be motivated to do that.
Do you have concern, though, looking through it, how they're going to keep these companies honest, even with a ban?
In a world where the financial liability is as large as we're talking about, I think it is one of the things that is not necessarily obvious outside the United States is that there are certain cottage industries that are facilitated or fostered by America's legal kind of culture. When you have a fee structure, a penalty structure like this, you end up having lawyers spring up that just specialize in fines like these. In a world where the money on the line is millions, if not billions of dollars, because you can imagine if Florida does it, other states will follow. The platforms will step in because they don't make that much money on each of these users. Like, one of the shocking stats that came out of the court filings was that Facebook estimated that the value of a teenage user was only about $250, right? When you have that kind of risk versus reward structure, you're going to have platforms that step up and act in different ways.
Knowing what you know about social media companies like Facebook, will they be engaging their legal teams right now? Will they be taking this to court?
We've already seen complaints from organizations like NetChoice. So NetChoice is a trade organization of, if you think of a large tech company, they're in NetChoice. That is complaining that this is a violation of their First Amendment rights. One of the interesting legal issues that is being worked out in the United States is to what extent is code speech? So if I have a software application, are you as the government allowed to in any way regulate that? Because in the act of typing out the code, is that an act of freedom of speech itself? And so there are unquestionably some important legal questions that are going to get litigated over the next couple of years. I can't read the future on it. But it seems unlikely that forever the courts are going to interpret that there are no ways in which you can cause companies, that there are no possible avenues to hold companies accountable.
Could they argue their way out of this ban?
Yeah, I mean, like they have billions of dollars in profits, tens of billions of dollars in profits. And they have a huge interest in hooking users young, hooking them early. You see them talk about it in those ways in the documents that were brought out by the attorneys general. And so they unquestionably will fight tooth and nail to make sure that they still have the rights to behave any way they want to behave, because there's a lot of money on the line.
Should Australia follow suit?
When you look at the data on the vulnerability of kids, it seems very clear that the window between the ages of 10 and 14 is one of the most critical time periods. The other critical time period is when kids leave home. They go away to college, they go off and become independent adults. When Australians are trying to decide, what do our youngest among us deserve online, I think having the chance to not grow up like a child star, right? Like, think about that for a second. 30 years ago, who in society, what 10-year-old in society had to worry about their personal brand? It was child stars, and we know how they turned out. When we ask, how should we protect these kids? We can either say, all the burden falls on the parent. They should be the one who has the fight over and over and over again with their kid over should they get a phone. Or we can say there should be reasonable rules of the road. And coming in and saying kids deserve a digital free bubble for some period of time. I think Australia should stand up and demand similar protections.
You have visited Australia. How do you evaluate our response to the harm of social media on a whole?
It's interesting. When I was down there, a bunch of topics that I usually talk about in the United States, I didn't get to talk about because you guys have stepped in and in many schools banned phones during the day. So in the United States, I talk to school principals and it makes me feel incredibly old because they'll talk about, going into a lunchroom. And when I was, say, 16 years old, the problem was how do you keep the lunchroom quiet enough? Right? You have the lunchroom monitors that are trying to keep the chaos down. And they talk about walking into quiet lunchrooms because the kids are all on their phones. Or school buses where kids aren't talking to each other. They have their headphones on and they're, cradled in their phones. Australia already has shown that they're willing to say, hey, kids need space to be kids. Like, the first thing kids need is to be able to connect with humans. They need to build those social skills. And so I think there's a really big opportunity for Australia to pioneer a third way. There's approaches that, say, the European Union has done in terms of saying, we're going to do this from a kind of bureaucratic top-down perspective. There's an approach in the United States where, we struggle to actually pass budgets or have a Speaker of the House, basic things. Australia has a history of stepping in and saying, it's time to act. You were the first to have an e-safety regulator. You regularly are willing to engage with these issues. And so I hope Australia continues building on that platform.
It takes a lot of courage to take on a juggernaut like Facebook. Why did you feel the need to do what you did?
I've said before that I felt like Facebook took my future away from me. That when I came to Facebook, I thought I was going to work on the U.S. 2020 election. Based on what they said about my job title, my role. And I showed up and learned for the first time that, the very simple kind of view of software that I had always thought about. I've worked on projects like Pinterest before. That those ways of thinking about software left behind, the most vulnerable 1 billion or 2 billion people in the world. That Facebook was the internet for some of the most fragile communities in the world. And those same communities didn't get any safety systems because they spoke languages beyond maybe the 50 largest in the world. There's like 4,000 or 5,000 languages in the world, depending on how you count. Some people say as high as 8,000. I came forward because Facebook was underfunding efforts to prevent things like ethnic violence, and they were lying to the public about how their content moderation systems work. And I expected to see not just, say, violence like Myanmar, where 25,000 people died, or 100,000 in Ethiopia. I looked forward to the future and saw those kinds of incidences continuing over and over again as long as Facebook was allowed to continue to operate. And so it didn't feel like I had a choice. I saw the negligence they were doing, and I knew that if I didn't speak out, I would lay in bed 20 years down the line seeing those new chapters unfold of this dystopian world, knowing that I could have done something. And so I came forward because I felt like the public had to have the full information if they were going to make decisions to keep themselves safe.
Working there, what did you find out about the harm being caused on kids?
It's so interesting. When I was documenting critical issues for public safety, I knew that the further I got from my main field of specialization, which is algorithms, ethnic violence, foreign interference, the further I got from that, the more likely it was Facebook's security systems would notice that I was reading a lot of things that were kind of outside my lane. And so all of the things that have unfolded in the last 2 years, in terms of the 44 state lawsuit, in terms of the lawsuits from school districts across North America, came from just about 100 documents that I brought out of 22,000 pages of documents. So maybe 1,000 pages out of 22,000 pages were around kids. But what those documents showed was that Facebook knew its products were causing harm to kids, that they knew at least some of the avenues, things like notifications, things like like counts, that they had run experiments trying to mitigate those harms and chosen not to launch them. And just that seed of information opened the door such that lawsuits and the discovery process could begin bringing out radically more information. And so that's how that little seed of truth has now spawned, lawsuits that may add up to tens of billions of dollars of damages for the company.
Why didn't they do anything to mitigate the harm?
One of the interesting things we see when we read through the hundreds and hundreds of pages that have been released by the attorneys general is that the culture inside of Facebook valued a small number of metrics over more subjective harms. So things like the number of active users, the number of minutes people spent per day or per month. Those were concrete things that the company used as a North Star. And when they were forced to weigh a subjective harm, like say kids saying, I can't focus in school, or I feel really stressed, the internal culture didn't know how to, say, break the glass and say, we need to reevaluate what success looks like. Instead, they deferred to the fact that Mark Zuckerberg really cared about a few metrics. And the reality is, everything goes to Mark. He has control over the company. And that played out with disastrous consequences.
So to put it really bluntly, they put profits before kids.
They unquestionably put profits before kids. They refused to take responsibility. And like when I've said before, I think Facebook needs to declare moral bankruptcy. I mean, they need to reassess what relationship do they want to have with the public. They have to actually take responsibility for the things that they've done if they want to be able to build towards a more healthy and successful future for all of our children.
TikTok, of course, Chinese owned. If it's already going to be hard to enforce the ban with the likes of Facebook and Instagram, how do you enforce the ban with TikTok?
Well, it is a similar thing. If you write in and you say, my kid is under 13 and they don't take that account down, it's still a $10,000 penalty. ByteDance is an American, they're a corporation that operates in the United States. You can't get around fines that are levied against you. And I think it's even probably more, it's likely that TikTok is even more sensitive to these economic influences because they actually struggle to monetize, to make money out of their users. They have less cash to offset those violations.
And among the more popular social media platforms for children that age, there's a reason they called it the TikTok bill.
When we look at the number of minutes spent per day on different applications, one of the differences between TikTok and, say, Instagram is that because you only get more content on TikTok if you actively advance it onwards, kids end up spending huge spans of time on these applications. The average amount of time a child in the United States spends on social media overall right now is about 3 hours per day. And if you look at it, I think the provision in the bill is if an app has people using it more than 2 hours a day, it falls under the scope. You can see it's if 10% of their users use it more than 2 hours a day. You can see that they're trying to target that kind of compulsive behavior.
What would your message be to Australian parents concerned about the harm social media is having on their kids?
One of the things that isn't obvious when we think about social media is that social media is not monolithic. Even inside the companies, they don't think about their safety practices, their levels of staffing as being for the whole world. They think about it market by market by market. And one of the things that we've seen time and time again is that these platforms invest their safety resources not based on need, they base them on fear of consequences. And how that can end up playing out is if you are a smaller market, and Australia counts as a smaller market, you end up getting less staffing for basic safety services. One key example of this is Australian English is not identical to American English. One of the things I learned on my recent visit to Australia is the phrase, an open slather, right? So my husband got this message from someone we were working with that said, social media is a bit of an open slather. And he was like, Francis, what does that mean? And we had to look it up on Google. Turns out it's only in Australia and a Kiwiism. The current safety systems for these platforms are only customized to American English and sometimes British English. That means if a safety system is meant to protect your kid from, say, eating disorder content, self-harm content, maybe even bullying, definitely for hate speech, racial slurs, there's language that is used in Australia that is not identical to the United States, and those safety systems are not the same. Your kids are not treated as having equal value to a child in the United States because they're not as afraid of regulation. And the way you can get more safety dollars invested by these platforms is by making them scared that you're going to act. So stand up and demand more from the Australian government, demand more for Australia, and you'll get different safety systems.
So should Australian parents be demanding a similar ban?
Australia has already taken a step forward by saying, maybe phones don't belong in schools. I think there's similar opportunities around things like, should social media platforms operate after 11 o'clock at night for children? Should we value sleep more? And I think that's a place where Australia can put the flag on the map and say, there should be guardrails for these systems. In China, the equivalent of TikTok only allows children under the age of 18 to use their app for 40 minutes a day. It turns off at 10 p.m. The content that they see is very different. It's much more educational. In China, they know these apps have consequences, that they influence children, that they can harm children. Australian children deserve to have healthy and safe childhoods online as well.